All right, how does this sound? Okay? All right, here.
In the middle.
Okay, how's everyone doing? I see some faces here that I think might be interested in this topic, and that's really good to see. One of the challenges here is just going to be how to balance out some really, specific on-the-ground issues with some larger, big-picture questions, about water, and also how in the weeds we want to get about this, about hydrology, about state law, about local conflicts. So that's going to be my job, just kind of trying to thread that needle. But to begin with, just ask every panelist here to introduce themselves with their names and what they do. That's how I open every radio interview, and that's how we'll open the discussion today. So take it away, Cassie.
I'm Cassie Gresham. I am an attorney with Braun and Gresham, and our office is actually in Dripping Springs. And we represent owners of rural land and deal with water issues on all rural land where our clients are, and we deal with a lot of groundwater issues and surface water, wastewater issues.
Good morning, I'm Donovan Burton. I work for a tiny little water utility, San Antonio Water System, about 1.7 million, so it's a pretty small organization. My title is Vice President of Water Resources, Conservation, and Government Relations, and pretty much every week they add another comma to do something else. I got to justify the existence, but this will kind of get into it, but the intersection of water development and politics is kind of why we created the job that I've got, and obviously conservation is a huge piece of that, and so that's kind of who I am and what I do.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is John Dupnik. I'm the general manager of the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District, and that is a groundwater conservation district, the so-called preferred method of groundwater management in the state. So big burden, big responsibility for us to manage that side of the hydrological equation. In terms of my duties, I'm the general manager. The general part means that I do everything, and we're small staffs, relatively small budget. So in terms of commas and duties, I've got lots of them. I have to do everything from take out the trash to go testify at the legislature, so it's never dull.
So in a kind of in a shorthand that a reporter might use, we could look to Cassie to represent rural property owners who are often also people with water rights, people who have control of this stuff. We could look to Donovan as somebody who is working with a growing city that's trying to answer its water needs, right, Donovan? And that is really one of the main challenges facing the whole state today. And we could look to John as someone who's trying to also make sure that this precious resource is conserved. There's a value to water in the ground. It's not something that you just want to just pump away and do whatever you want with it, right? Now that's an oversimplification, and that's part of my job, perhaps, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But for those of you who don't come to this with a lot of expertise, I thought maybe I just kind of back that up. Does that seem fair to you all? Or, the way this panel's set up is to look at the incoming legislative session. And so my first question is just going to be really general. What are you looking for? I think Mike did a search of bills that have already been filed with the word groundwater in them. There aren't many yet, but that doesn't mean there won't be. And that also doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of bills out there that will touch on groundwater, even if they don't have the word in it. Sure. So how about you, Cassie?
Well, John and I were visiting this morning because we worked on the electric purification issue in Hays County. For those of you that are kind of familiar with the local issue, in the last legislative session, there was a company that came in and there was no groundwater district over a portion of Hays County. And Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer was expanded in the legislature to encompass a portion of Hays County that would allow them to permit, and I worked on the landowner side of that closely with John to make that happen. So I'll be looking to see that that's going to change. Very closely, we were talking about, I think that there'll be some pushback on that.
Really?
Yeah. So that's the first thing. We also, at the firm, we do lobbying. We also have lobbyists that we work with, depending on what the issue is and how high profile it was. And on the electric purification issue, we hired a lobbyist. I mean, we do lobbying and we did the local part, but we hired a lobbyist firm in Austin to help us. And that was really powerful. So I'll be looking at any issues affecting landowners, and I look at groundwater issues, any property tax issues, any things affecting rural landowners, and we track those. And we have, just like any lobbyist firm, keywords.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I look at all those bills that come through.
So you're looking at property rights, you're looking at eminent domain, I imagine? I mean,
Yes.
pipeline issues are
Yeah.
going to be,
Well, part of the whole EP thing was eminent domain. So we had a bill that was passing that dealt with the groundwater district. We also had a bill that was being proposed to remove the ability for a special district to have condemnation power, eminent domain power, if they're going to give that power to a private entity to then condemn. And what was happening in Hays County was Goforth's special utility district has eminent domain power, but they didn't have the money to build the pipeline. So what they were doing was they were contracting to give electric purification, a private company, the ability to condemn all the landowners' property along the way, just delegating that authority. And there was a bill, although it didn't move, there's some compromises that were made, to remove that power from that special district, which they were very concerned about because they don't really have the money to build the pipeline or to maintain it. And so they wanted to be able to delegate that. That's a big problem for landowners in Texas of accountability. If you have private districts, I'm getting off, I get all excited about this, but if we take our governmental authority, what a city of Austin might have, and give that to a private company, then there's less accountability because there's not elected officials to go talk to. It's a private company that's building that line and maintaining it and condemning. And I know it's related to groundwater because of water pipelines, but it's a big issue in Texas, and so I'll be watching that as well.
excellent. Donovan?
Yeah, so we'll see a lot of, there certainly haven't been a lot of groundwater bills filed as of yet, but I think there's a lot in the upcoming area. So I think a lot of people will be focused on groundwater. Be lots of discussion on a whole lot of different topics, and it'll spread the gamut. And not just groundwater, you'll see surface water, reuse, all sorts of different things that
Anything you'd like to see? Any unfinished business or any kind of big question marks you'd like to see answered in
lots of
legislation?
stuff. And so from a municipal perspective, I think what we generally look towards is we'll look to some changes for the regulatory framework, but really for long-term certainty. So for right now, for example, there are lots of groundwater districts that will have a 3-year permit, a 5-year permit. Some of them have longer. We even have one that's 40 years. But so a municipality will go out and spend hundreds of millions, even into the billions of dollars on a project.
Like yours just has.
And get a 3 to 5 year permit.
Yeah.
And that's just not very good long-term certainty for a municipality to spend that kind of money that could theoretically go away within a few years. And so I think some long-term certainty, we made some good progress towards that in the last legislative session, which would allow for permits to be automatically or administratively reviewed and extended if no changes are in effect. I think there could be some clarifications to that to make sure that it applies to the transportation of the groundwater as well. I think there are some modest changes that can be made. But from a regulatory perspective, I think the municipalities want long-term certainty, also some checks and balances. Any governmental entity, none of them are perfect, and some of them every now and then make the wrong decision. And you've got to have the ability to appeal that. There's got to be an appellate process. And I think there needs to be more of an appellate type process in the world of groundwater. There's just not a whole lot of it on that say. So some checks and balances, some representation. There's the GMA process, the groundwater, or the DFC process. I don't know how in-depth we are here. You know, it's pretty simple. The GCDs set the DFCs and they send them to the TWDB, who does the MAG and sends it back to the.
Crystal clear.
Yeah, very, very simple. But I think we've had some discussions about, I think with a local committee about some representation as part of that GMA, so that a few more voices are considered. I think there's an advisory committee that will be set up, hopefully through some legislation. And then just making sure that the decisions are science-based. I think there's a lot that can be done in the world of brackish groundwater that's not being used and can't be used, but the regulatory framework of brackish groundwater, I think, has a lot to be flushed out, and I think
forgive me for cutting in, but you said earlier the brackish is currently regulated in the same way as
yes, mostly, yes.
Yeah, okay. As water that we would take out and put into our
Yes.
municipal systems. You think that maybe that should change?
I think that very much should change,
Yeah.
and it's not as simple as all brackish water. Just like all groundwater is not all groundwater is not all groundwater.
Right.
There are differences, but there are certainly a lot of pockets throughout the state of brackish water that's not being used, that's confined away from the fresh water. So pulling out of it won't mix and won't destroy, won't contaminate the freshwater supplies, and has a high productivity that could be balanced, and that would leave a lot of the freshwater supplies for the local and smaller entities, and for those that don't have the kind of money and wherewithal to pull out of that area. And so,
All right. John, how about you?
Well, the quick reaction to that particular point, and there's a full gamut of issues that have been discussed in depth, and if anybody saw the interim hearings and things, it seems clear that groundwater districts are going to be in a real defensive posture. So particularly when it comes to exports and moving water from rural areas where the water is to urban areas where the water isn't and it's needed, that's a big issue in and of itself. But in response to Donovan's comments about the brackish water, this was discussed in depth both by the Texas Water Conservation Association prior to last session and during the last session, where a bill was floated, and a version of a bill that just would study brackish water actually came out. But one of the concerns that groundwater districts had, or let me put that aside, I'll say just myself,
Sure.
personally, my own professional opinion is that going all the way back into the 50s, there was a debate building up to the creation of the Groundwater Conservation District Act over whether surface water and groundwater should be treated the same. And in the 50s, when that act was passed, there was a wedge driven between the two. And, I've got a technical background. I'm a professional geoscientist, and so it's offensive to me to say that they're different animals, that surface water and groundwater are different things, and legally they should be treated the same. But it started in the 50s, and the simple fact is that surface water is owned by the state.
Right.
Groundwater is private property. It's treated differently. Arguably, it's all the same water.
Is that even an argument? I mean, it is all the same water. Could we say that scientifically?
It absolutely. Here's the best example. Scientifically, of course. In my district, Onion Creek, 18 miles south of here, it's flowing in the surface of the creek. It's state water. It crosses in driftwood, goes over the recharge zone, hits a cave. As soon as it gets into the ground, it's private property. How do you reconcile that? I don't know. And then it zips past all these private properties on its way to Barton Springs as private property, as it's quickly moving along. Pops out of the springs, and then it's state water again. So again, just from a technical perspective, that's a little offensive, but that's the lay of the land. That's what we have to work with. My concern as it relates to brackish water is that we've got this illogical separation of groundwater and surface water. We have to live with it. If we start to carve out brackish water and separate it from fresh groundwater, we're going to create some situation down the road where we've got another illogical subdivision of this one hydrological cycle that we've got to deal with, and it's going to set the precedent for that. And I understand where Donovan and those that want to develop this resource are coming from, is that right now it's underutilized. They want to remove any regulatory impediments to actually investing in what will be an expensive proposition, which is to desalinate brackish water. So they want to limit any impediments to that and create some regulatory uncertainty. But this notion of carving it out, fragmenting, the global holistic water supply, and creating this separate type of water I think will be problematic. Because the simple fact of it is that while it's brackish water, say down dip, it's generally part of a shared formation where in the shallower end, in the outcrop, and I don't want to get too technical,
Sure.
it's going to be fresh. And so you can pump like crazy in the saltwater side, it's going to have an effect. They're interconnected formations. So that notion of separating all these waters just really makes me
I want to give
anxious.
I want to give Donovan a chance to respond to that, but I also think that what you've done is open this up from the local, and you've even mentioned Onion Creek right there, to the kind of big question issues. But first, Donovan, I mean, what do you say to that? We may be dividing. we've already, you could say, irrationally, unscientifically divided water into these different categories. Is it a dangerous thing to continue to do that when maybe we should be thinking about it more holistically?
Yeah, I definitely see a holistic approach, but just like we talked about, that water is not water is not water. A lot of brackish water is not the same as other brackish water. He talks about some of the water that goes underground and then comes back out of the springs, and that is certainly the case. But there's a lot of particularly brackish groundwater that's been it's confined off in a different layer. It has almost no communication whatsoever with the fresh water. That I think you don't necessarily have to treating them differently is a little bit different, but you need to incentivize the production. I think you should incentivize the production of those areas. I think science needs to play the part when you've got to be able to recognize that to make sure that that water is not going to impact the fresh water. And if you can find those pockets of brackish water that don't impact the fresh, I think that's where you can target incentivizing that kind of water.
Okay.
That doesn't mean necessarily treating it different. Land use all over. You'll treat an area over the aquifer recharge zone different than an area not over the recharge zone. So I think there are ways to carve out different regulations to incentivize something over here that's not going to have a detriment, while at the same time protecting or having a different form of regulation over something else. So I think you can do all of the above.
Yeah, I agree with that aspect of it, is that you need to encourage the development of it, or at least remove the impediments. But I don't think the impediments are regulatory. I don't think it needs its own regulatory structure. I think the impediments are the characterization of the aquifers, the science behind development of it, characterizing how production in one zone is going to affect another area. So that really speaks to an investment in the science, an investment through grants, through the development board, through other means, through cooperation with groundwater conservation districts, and really helping to queue up the research side, the characterization side, to assess the feasibility and the cost of whether it's even can be developed, in an economical way. Perfect example, I think, because it's perfect because it's in my district, of where a groundwater district can play a role in that is our district invested $160,000 of our little meager groundwater district budget in drilling a sophisticated monitor well near the Texas Disposal Systems landfill. It's an 1,100-foot well. It's all saline water. It's a multi-port well that allows us to collect data and to really look at the quality, the yield, the production of those various zones for the sole purpose of propping up that characterization, such that if a developer wanted to come in, it removes some of that risk. They know from the outset what they're dealing with, what the quality is, what the yield is, and they can, for themselves, determine whether it makes economical sense to further develop that resource. So I think from a scientific perspective, there does need to be some development, some encouragement, some funding of the science. But on the regulatory side, it's all water, and it needs to be managed in a holistic way, in my opinion.
Cassie, when you deal with property owners who own the rights to the water beneath their land, how do you describe that to them? How do you make sense of this idea that you own this water, but you're also, to borrow the phrase, you're sharing from the common pool, right?
Sure. Well, I mean, it came up in Hays County on the electropurification issue, and I think I was telling you this before. It's really hard, and we were talking about this before too, that those landers in Hays County, the reason why they were not in a groundwater district was because they had opposed that for years and years and years. And when we go to the legislature, I remember sitting in a hearing, and Lyle Larson it said, "Why are you here? We've been trying to get you in a groundwater district for years. You deserve this. You wouldn't be regulated." So what I often see is, from a property rights perspective, is a landowner saying, "This is mine, I own this, right? This is under my land, this is my water." But when you start saying, "Well, yeah, but the neighbor over there also owns his water,"
Right. Yeah.
or that company is leasing, owns this water, and they can pump out as much as they want when they're not in a groundwater district. And that affects what you have, then it's a whole new ballgame of how they feel about that and whether or not that's fair. And it's a weird mix of property rights. It's like, yes, I own this water, and I want you to also own your water, but I don't want you to take my water.
Yeah.
And how do I control that?
Right.
So it in Hays County, it was fascinating. I mean, we're based there, so I actually live in Austin, but I drive out every day. But I know that the politics out there, and it was the first time I've ever seen Tea Party, very, very conservative, libertarian landowners side by side with very, very liberal Democrats working on the same issue. And water is that issue. And they were they were just hand in hand. And if you drive up 150 and see all the Save Our Wells signs that all the landowners put out during that time period, and some of those are still up, they laughed about it. It was hilarious that they would get along, that they would be on the same page. And so property rights in the water context is very complicated because it's kind of, yes, this is my water, but it's also our water. And I think that property owners are starting to see that and starting to see the need to be regulated more than they did before. And what's crazy about the state of Texas, or what I find really crazy, is that I didn't know this until we had this issue come up in Hays County, but there are pockets of there aren't groundwater districts all over Texas.
Yeah, it's about a third of the state?
Yeah. I mean, there's
so
like
about
whole
a third of the
swaths.
state doesn't have any of these organizations to regulate.
And it's, so in some areas it's a big problem, in some areas it's not, because they don't have much groundwater. But
here's a question that any of y'all could pick up. What is the use of a groundwater district? And this is something that is still kind of being, I guess, figured out legally. If a property owner has the right to this water and has the right to be compensated if that right is restricted, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting current law. Should we have more regulation? I mean, does the groundwater district need to have a little bit more control to ensure that we keep enough water in the ground for future generations?
that's a really hard.
Yeah.
No, you hit the nail on the head. Is that, being the general manager of the Groundwater Conservation District, you characterize exactly where the dilemma is that districts are in the position to where they have to comply with two mandates that are mutually exclusive in a lot of cases.
Okay.
You have to be able to manage to protect private property in place, and a landowner's groundwater in place, which is exclusively private property, and that was affirmed by what's called the Day case, and there's no question about that. At the same time, we have a mandate to preserve what are called desired future conditions, and that's a policy decision made by a planning group that sets ultimately what is a limit on what an aquifer can produce.
Yeah.
And so where the dilemma comes in is that when everybody's exercising the right to pump their private property, and collectively all of that pumpage starts to bump up against this finite cap that we are by law required to manage, how do you reconcile that? If you don't allow that new owner to come in and to produce their groundwater, arguably you're taking their property. If the aquifer is fully allocated and a utility has so-called investment-backed expectations, they've invested millions of dollars in infrastructure and pipes and the wells and everything else, are you supposed to curtail from their allocation to be able to make room for that new owner? Because arguably, if you've impeded on their investment-backed expectation, that's a takings claim on that side of things.
Sure.
So groundwater districts are really caught in the middle, and it's a very difficult proposition. The only solution that I can come up with, and it never gets any traction at all, but I think it's important, is that since it's state law that districts are legally required to preserve private property, at the same time manage the long-term availability of these aquifers, when they make these decisions, if they do result in takings claims, it's not illegal to cause a takings. You can regulate in a way that would take someone's property. The rub is that you have to provide just compensation.
Sure.
Districts don't have unlimited amounts of money to write checks to everybody that has had their private property rights infringed on. My thought is that the state should have a role in providing some liability protection and providing that compensation for takings. And if that's the case, then a groundwater district can make the decisions they need to, which are not popular and which may be difficult, to be able to preserve the long-term availability of an aquifer, even if it rises to the level of a takings, if that compensation is provided by some other source.
That strikes me as a creative workaround to a issue that could also be more simply dealt with just with kind of rewriting the law. But and when we talk about water, we talk about these larger issues like you're just touching on now. And as legislative sessions come and go, people sometimes talk about, are we going to deal with interbasin transfers this year? Are we going to deal with some of these big questions of property rights? And it's no, not really.
That's too
and so
complicated.
then we have perhaps proposals like the one you just floated, where they're like, this could work.
Yeah.
But again, he said that's never gotten any traction either. I guess.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a good idea. Nobody else seems to.
I think it's a good idea, because our landers want to be compensated.
There you go.
Well, and I'd be
Building
interested-
consensus. What do you think, Donovan?
Well, yeah, it's that we ran into that with the Edwards Aquifer, and it's the ultimate state mandated, is sort of federally mandated, but the state required an exact cap on the amount of permits that you can issue. But there are cases out there, and I think some of them are still pending, but they could result in a takings issue. And in that scenario, the Groundwater District, the Edwards Aquifer Authority, would be required to pay those landowners. And the state told them do it this way, and now the Groundwater District is held responsible for doing it. So I sympathize with that remark, and so we're interested in, maybe we can craft a bill here today about.
Let
I
the
think
state pay.
But I would say though, and this may go, you're talking about the state law with the finite cap and all that. Obviously, we're here today to talk about changes in state law, and I think the MAG is a cap issue. I think is some area where you could have some changes, and the fact that the state legislates the amount of water that can come out of a groundwater area in a district, I think should be revisited. I think these are all based off of models, which you hear you're the model guy, but all models are wrong, but some of them are helpful, and so it's hard to run a state legislative thing mandating this cap based off of a model that may or may not be correct. It'll be changed over the year, and sometimes you have to see the actual production of it to see how it works, and so. I get a little bit frustrated with the state legislature legislating every piece of this.
Well,
this
it
thing.
is difficult too. Texas is so big,
Yeah.
so the water issues in one area of the state may be completely different in another area of the state. And how do you have a state regulation that addresses the diverse water needs of a state? And I think that's really difficult. I mean. The water issues in Central Texas are different than they are in East Texas.
Mm-hmm.
They have reservoirs that they can use, and to build a reservoir
Well,
here
yeah, I
would
mean,
be ridiculous, So
We've done it before.
we have done it before.
Yeah.
So, you jump in.
I was about to say, I mean, the sort of theme of this entire day, I think, is state versus local, and how do you balance that? You're really starting to see it play out in the groundwater realm because always, from the year the Groundwater District Act was passed back in the 50s, local control, so-called local control, was the preferred method. And politically, it was easy to say that those decisions affect you at the local level, let those folks make those decisions. But now it's very interesting to see the trends turn completely. And, I saw in the write-up of the ads for this summit, the bag bans and the fracking bans, and how the state has intervened on very local decisions where it was never thought that groundwater districts would see that sort of influence or some sort of push to go to state governance. You're starting to see it, and it's really, if you could judge the tenor of the interim hearings, there was this really, really a big push to have the state intervene where they felt like local decisions needed adult supervision or needed to be overturned.
Well,
Yeah.
we had I mean, even on the electric purification bill that we were working on last session, in lobbying on that, we would go in and argue, this is a local issue, this is a local issue, this is a Hayes County issue, you don't need to worry about it. But if you look at the opposition to that bill, it was from Charles Perry, who's up in Lubbock, and I can't remember the representative who's out in El Paso.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, statewide, we're like, where is this coming from, and why do you care about this small area in Hayes County? But it's because of the, politics and policy of, they were afraid of setting some
precedent.
precedent that was going to be carried out,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, obviously, local control, and you get into this push and pull, but there's also a regional component to it, and I think a lot of the consternation with certain groundwater districts that are single county and certain issues that are single county, they obviously impact a larger area, and so I think more regionalization and more discussing about regional regulatory environments and that sort of thing, I think are helpful. I think the going towards the DFC process as it was created, I think was a good step in the right direction. I think there are still lots of different things that can be changed in that regionalized process, but I think a regional approach to groundwater management, I think, is helpful as well.
And a more scientific approach, I'd imagine.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Scientific
where's the science on that, John? I mean, could we create, districts that more accurately reflect the hydrology, in terms of where we're pumping from, where we're taking from?
So, man, you're speaking to something that really been an impassionate topic for me. When I went through graduate school, this was the entire subject of my thesis, is to regionalize groundwater management. And so, the ultimate findings of my exhaustive hours sitting in front of my computer and solving all the problems was that state-level governance doesn't make sense because conditions are so variable across the state. So that's clear. But does county-level governance make a lot of sense? If I'm being completely honest, from an academic perspective, it does not. Just the economies of scale. For no other reason, the economies of scale don't allow a district with their existing funding mechanisms to generate enough revenue to do anything other than administratively issue permits in a lot of instances.
Okay.
So there's not a lot of resources available to do the research, do the monitoring, develop the models, make science-based decisions. So the state's solution to that was to create this existing framework of groundwater management areas that are aligned around the major aquifers in the state. And that structure exists. This entire DFC planning process, it happens within that construct. However, I agree with Donovan, as I think that process needs improvement. It needs to be bolstered. It needs to be affected in a way that those decisions are more meaningful, that all the existing county-based districts over a shared aquifer can manage in a more uniform way. I think all that can happen within the GMA construct, within the structure that's already in place. As it is, it's just loosely enforced, so it could be improved.
We've got 2 bills for the legislature so far.
Sorry?
So we've written 2 bills up here today.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay, great. Well,
So far, and we're
got it.
still, I don't know how much time we have
haven't
left.
Got it all
Pass.
figured out.
yeah.
Let's just keep going.
Well, it's one of these things. Every session, you can spend weeks reporting on bills that have been filed, and then a few months later, you're like, why did I devote so much time? It's like, what percentage of these things?
Yeah.
But let's throw them out and see what happens. It strikes me the picture you painted, Cassie, a few minutes ago of these people with different political ideologies coming together to develop a regulatory framework for water. It's a hopeful kind of picture, at least unless you're the person who's interested in buying that water and moving it somewhere else.
Sure.
In that case, it's not perhaps as hopeful. But it suggests that maybe the worse things get, the better we will become in understanding this. Once there's a pressure put on us to kind of realize that the pressure itself lets us know that we're all in this together and that we need to create better frameworks for dealing with it. But I'm curious if that's not also, and I don't mean to mischaracterize the picture you painted, but that's the way it kind of appeared in my mind. But then I wondered if that wasn't too optimistic, because obviously there are we are one state, and there are larger cities that are going to need more water, right? And where do we stand in terms of balancing those two needs, the needs of the rural communities with the cities?
Well, the picture I was just painting was looking at rural landowners coming from different perspectives and how they had a common purpose.
Yeah.
What I didn't say.
No, I wasn't trying to suggest that you were.
No. And I think you brought up this point is there's business interests that are there as well as a conservation interest that's there and municipality interests that are there. And also, we could talk about let's base it on the science, but I can tell you that you get 2-3 scientists in the room and they completely disagree about what the science is, right? I mean, so, and we saw that in the issue we were dealing with. So I don't mean to paint a Pollyanna picture. I was intrigued by that.
Yeah.
And it made me probably hopeful that maybe there's some solutions that I hadn't thought of. But what I see is the biggest problem is what I voiced before, which is I think you do have to do it regionally. I don't think it can be a statewide thing. And when you get to the Capitol and you're dealing with legislation, I mean, it's who is chair of that committee and who's tied to this particular business and what constituent that they have that really cares about, and are they Democrat or Republican and what money is being paid.
Right.
I mean, it's just as dirty as you know that it is, So I, all of that to say, I don't think we're there yet. As far as feeling the need to address this issue. I think there's those of us that are chicken littles that are saying, the sky is falling, we need to, but, the drought certainly helped focus us in as a community, both statewide, regardless of party of, in the drought, we were all like, oh God, we got to deal with this issue, let's talk about it, and now we've gotten rain.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, we'll get rain, it'll be okay,
Yeah.
And so I think, that's just the nature. I think that's human nature. And so when we're in dire straits and we need water, we're going to focus on it. And then when we're in a legislative session where, we've had rain and it's not as big of an issue, I think there'll be some things that are done. But from a lobbyist perspective, when you're trying to move a bill forward, it sometimes takes, 2, 3, 4, 5 sessions. These sort of big ideas about regional groundwater management and how to move that forward, that is a 10, 20-year process, and you're going to get...
You're killing me.
So I was being Pollyannish before. I'm saying this is a serious problem, and it's going to we'll get a little bite of the apple, and then we'll try to maintain that.
Yeah.
And then you'll move it forward a little bit and go, okay, we fixed that, now we got to move that forward, and let's not take 2 steps back to correct something that we did the last session. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it does. It does. And I didn't mean to put words in your mouth when I said that.
No. I wasn't saying that. It's a big, huge challenge. I think the only thing I saw was I was shocked that people could come together. And I think that's the case with legislators too. I think they can when they see a common ground, when they have property rights is not necessarily, when you say that, you think, oh, it's a conservative belief, it's something I'm going to protect my property, and it really is, it's not as simple as that, so.
Well, I think that we probably have people here who are interested. Now, maybe could I just get a kind of general sense of how many people here are interested in asking questions? So I kind of thought we'd have a lot. So let's start right to left, and you, ma'am, we're going to bring a microphone over, and we'll try to get to as many people as we.
And John gets the hard ones. I'll take the.
Mose, who did you want to start with first?
I think that this woman here had a.
Good morning. 2 questions, one for Ms. Gresham and one for Mr. Burton. My 40-year-old eyes are having a little trouble. For Ms. Gresham, can you give some quick bullet points on differences between groundwater rights for residential versus commercial, and then within commercial, a mom and pop shop versus a 5,000 employee? And then for Mr. Burton, having come from Midwest, can you tell by my accent, living and recreating on or in the Great Lakes most of my life, can you speak to any of the conversations about non-Texas municipalities that are inquiring about Texas water use?
Can I ask you maybe to choose one of those two questions? Because there were quite a few people here, and I think we only have about 15 minutes left. Donovan, how about you? Because is there a large interest from out of state in Texas water?
Very much so, on many fronts, particularly groundwater, because we do it so much differently here, and we are unique when it comes to a lot of things, particularly groundwater, and that can be good and that can be bad. But I think you've got a lot of interest of external parties, external states looking at how we do it, but as well we look to them as well. So I think you have a lot of exchange of information going back and forth. Conservation, for example, we have one of the leading conservation sides in the nation, and so we go out to a lot of different states and talk to different municipalities, different organizations about ways of promoting conservation within your community. And then those people come to Texas as well, to different areas. I speak for San Antonio. And in fact, it goes further than just within the United States. We've got people from Israel coming over, and we go over there. I just got back actually from Africa, and so we've got, there's a whole lot of exchanging of information that all areas can learn from each other's successes and mistakes. We've certainly had our fair share of mistakes, and I think there's a lot of learning between lots of different entities. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Was that it? All right. Yes, sir.
It's a comment and a question. Is it, John mentioned this earlier, is that it sounds like kind of our fundamental flaw is that we decided in the last 100 years that groundwater is not a public resource, that it's a private resource. We're sliding towards dealing with it more as a public resource, but that seems like the tenor of the basis of the whole fight is that we treat surface water as a public resource, groundwater as a private resource, but both in surface water was recognized as a finite resource. It needs to be managed publicly, but we haven't sort of made that fundamental shift with groundwater. Are we going there? That's where this ought to be.
Right.
It ought to be managed regionally and statewide as a public resource. People shouldn't be able to pump water infinitely, and because when you're out, you're out. And so, is there some impetus at the state level to really ultimately go that direction?
And I appreciate you kind of boiling it down to that. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't agree that, I'm sure a lot of your clients wouldn't want to see groundwater suddenly become a public resource. But people are at least, and what you're saying is that people are at least beginning to think of it as a resource to be regulated on some level.
Well, and I think the day case kind of, so when you say it's kind of going more towards thinking of it as a public resource, the day case actually says, no, it's a
Right.
really private resource, and that's a pretty recent case. So whereas I think we were moving towards more that conversation of surface water and groundwater are interlinked, the day case, in my opinion, although it's helpful to landowners, took it back 2 steps back and said, no, not really. The way the law is right now, the law can change, is that it's a private resource and therefore it's a private taking. But I think landowners, when they're actually faced with the EP situation where they were going to be pumped more than what they had and they were concerned about their wells, they didn't think of it at that point as a private property right. They thought of it as a public resource.
Yeah.
That you shouldn't take more than your fair share. But it wasn't until they got to that where they were being impacted in that point, that it shifted their thinking about what really is property rights, was my point
Right.
before.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
anyway,
Yeah, John.
Yeah. So, but Chuck, I think you summed it up very well. And in fact, because of that discrepancy in how surface water and groundwater are viewed just legally, it really, over the years, the pressure has really started to further the gap between the logic of how you treat them. The pressure has been development of groundwater, just strictly by that legal construct and how they're viewed. And just to give you an example, almost all of the river basins in the state of Texas are completely subscribed. They're completely allocated. And if you want to go to the state of Texas to get a right to divert water, you got to get all the way in the back of the line. And if there's a drought and they start to curtail, you're the first one to get your water cut off. If you go to a groundwater district and ask that very same question from an aquifer that is arguably already oversubscribed, if the district were to say, as the TCQ did, nope, it's completely subscribed, get to the back of the line, you're subject to a takings claim. And you would have to pay that landowner, whereas the state just says that's the common resource, it's a common pool, it's owned by the state, it's in the public's interest, and therefore we can't over-allocate our water. That same sort of logic is not in place at groundwater. And so another example of that, interbasin transfers came up. On the surface water side of things, there's a law in Chapter 11 of the Administrative Code that says if you were to apply for a water right to pull water out of the Colorado River and move it over into the Guadalupe River Basin, not only do you get in the back of the line in terms of curtailments, but you have to go through this rigorous test to look at what is the effect of the basin of origin versus the receiving area. What is the cost or detriment to the basin of origin versus the benefit in the receiving area? On the groundwater side, it's going the completely opposite direction. In fact, the testimony at the legislature was basically groundwater districts are impediments to export, and therefore to require a transport permit is discriminatory and it doesn't make sense. And then there's also this notion that once you pump groundwater out of the aquifer doesn't care where the water goes or what it's used for. What's missing in that conversation is the communities in the basin where that water is withdrawn do care. There's an impact, because once that water is committed to some city far away and the infrastructure's built, the pipelines are built, it's never coming back. So arguably, a rural area that has shipped that water off to some other urban area is mortgage their economic development potential for the future because they no longer have that water available to them. How do you assess that effect when you're looking at these exports? Not only is there a very rigorous test in place on the surface water side, that test is not in place on the groundwater side, and in fact, there's efforts to remove any sort of evaluation of it. So to your point, because of that legal construct, the emphasis is moved completely away from surface water, and the demand and the pressure is entirely on groundwater now.
We probably have time for at least two more, right? So, whoever was next, and then Linda will get to you.
My question's actually pretty similar, but I have a different direction with it. It seems like the science of ecology has changed greatly over time, and we understand air pollution now is a global, stream that affects everybody, and groundwater seems just as, the same. The groundwater in California being used affects Mexico and everywhere else. Shouldn't it be regulated on a federal level? It seems like different organizations siloed with their own interest are going to cause fractured, goals and directions, and a singular federal oversight might be the best thing for groundwater. Is that not logical?
Is it not logical? I mean,
All
we're
at
working
once?
on, we're struggling with the idea of state oversight here, so you may be, but is that an argument that you all have heard? I mean, I don't know who, if there's precedent for that. It is true. So I was thinking about that this morning. If it is all the same water, right? If it's all the same water, you could envision a time into the future where there needs to be a kind of global consensus on this use. And that's what some of us are beginning to see when it comes to something like climate change. The idea of keep fossil fuels in the ground in order to this larger global protection. But it does seem that I haven't heard much about that idea when it comes to water use yet. It
I
seems.
think United Nation regulatory structure is not going to pass in this legislature.
Yeah,
It'll
yeah.
take a few more legislatures.
But I think it's an
to get
interesting
through.
point.
No, but I think there are certainly impacts and interest throughout any regulatory structure, whatever regulatory structure is in place. And I think there's a way to manage the current one. I think is perfectly okay. I think there's some changes that need to be made, but whatever circumstance there is, it needs to have very good science. Whoever is regulating it needs to have very good science, and they need to be very in tune with the local communities that are in place, not only directly above the ground, but I think, the municipalities, I think they need to have a close hand here. I think we've seen it, for example, on waters of the U.S. Cassie, I don't know if you're involved in that, but from a landowner perspective, the federal government, some would argue, have overreached and tried to sort of take control of what's described as a water of the U.S. And I think the Trump administration has already said that they're going to roll that back. That's its own life. But I think certainly it will stay and probably should stay and should stay. I shouldn't say probably here more locally in Texas. But whatever framework should take a larger view at it, and they should develop good science.
Okay. I believe you, and then you.
Howdy. First, I just want to say that I appreciate many, if not all, of the comments. And I'm sorry to have to ask such a narrow question, but I'm here representing those damn hippies out in Bastrop who've been working with some of the most right-wing conservative landowners. Mr. Burton knows all about this. Who live over the Simsboro Aquifer. We have 2 groundwater districts over the most sought-after groundwater, probably in Texas, certainly in central Texas. And we feel that we're under siege with over 124,000 acre-feet being recently permitted. And we have been in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the big bad water bully known as SAWS. Seriously, Mr. Burton has been very forthcoming in talking to us, which we appreciate. So here's my question for you. Could you please confirm or deny that SAWS has now brokered some kind of deal with the GBRA for GBRA dropping their mid-basin project for Vista Ridge groundwater? And if that is true, if the rumor is true, how much water are we talking about here that GBRA has bought into? Is it 15,000 acre feet, 20,000 acre feet? Tell us what we need to know.
Well, I'll confirm that is not correct. If that's, I'll answer it in the negative. No, not in any sense of the imagination. We certainly talk to the GBRA about different things. They are working on their own water projects. We talk as a region. As you know, the Vista Ridge project is going right down the fastest growth corridor of the nation, and lots of different communities are involved. And so we certainly are talking to different communities, different interest groups, and about that water, but absolutely nothing has been worked out with GBRA on that. In fact, we talk more with GBRA about our effluent and our reuse going downstream. There's just a whole nother case going on about that. But no, nothing has been worked with GBRA at all.
And I imagine most people in the audience are familiar with this issue, but this is pertaining to a large pipeline project that SAWS is going to begin building early next year. From Burleson County to bring water to San Antonio. It is an issue that would be great to devote an entire panel to, but it's as I said, one of these, much like the Onion Creek issue as well, that is even more local to us here in Austin. One of these local issues that that also resonates statewide, of course. And to call it local is maybe not completely accurate, but one of the single issues.
Yeah, regional.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we had one more question.
Good morning. Okay, so y'all have touched on how some areas are covered by groundwater districts and some are not, and therefore some places have a voice in sort of this policy process with the GMA. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little more about that and what kind of problems arise from that.
Well, if there's not a groundwater district in an area in Texas, then if a company, a business, a landowner wants to put in a development, they can pump as much water, groundwater, as they want. There's no limit. They don't have to get a permit. There's no, they can take whatever's underneath their property, and there's no regulation of that. And in the case of Hays County, there was electropurification was coming in from Houston, and they leased local landowners' property. There was no regulation of that. Those landowners owned their water beneath their property as a property right. They would say that. They did say that, and they're entitled to sell the groundwater that's underneath their property. And EP was selling that to Buda and to a development called Anthem. And at the time, they ended up doing something else. And to the Goforth Special Utility District. So in Texas, where there are no groundwater districts, there's no regulation of that. You can go out and develop a piece of property and bring in a bunch of residences or have a commercial business and pipe that wherever you want it to go.
Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, I might ask our panelists if there's any final thoughts that they would share with the audience. We've had kind of free-ranging conversation. That might be my fault, but I think we've touched on a lot of really interesting topics. Is there any one or two things that you would leave with people? It's a classic reporter's question at the end of the interview. What have I missed? Anything else, Cassie?
I would encourage people to stay engaged on the issue and really...
Even when it's raining?
Even when it's raining. Because if you can, I know this is going to sound very hokey, right? But you can really, if you're engaged landowner, consumer, constituent, you're all represented by a legislator wherever you are. And really watching what bills are coming through and paying attention to that, I think that's really important. And from my client's perspective, we're watching on their behalf. But I think it's important as citizens that we're engaged in this conversation, that we're asking those questions, that we're pushing back on our legislators to think about those things. And they do really care. When I'm going around the Capitol, and I'm talking to somebody that's from Lubbock, I'll say, I have a client that's in Lubbock. Do you know such and such? So it is about relationships, and they do care if it impacts their particular local issue and constituents. So I think it's really important that we all participate in that process, and we're asking all these great questions.
Donovan, I feel like we kind of haven't touched a lot on just the fact that our growing cities are thirsty, and that conservation plays a role, but that the decision San Antonio made as well is that eventually new resources might be necessary. Anything about that as we're thinking about the future of the state 10, 20 years out, how is that going to change the equation?
Yeah, I think it's a sobering thought to think that there are 1 million new people coming to San Antonio and throughout, obviously more than that, throughout the state. A lot of them will be in the municipalities. A lot of them will move out into a suburban, exurban, and rural area. I think from a groundwater perspective and a water perspective, we can no longer think of this as an us versus them, our water, your water, my water, her water. It needs to be a more an approach that takes a much larger perspective going forward. Absolutely, conservation, you've got to do, we look at conservation not as a green feel-good kind of thing. We look at it as a business model. The more water we save, the less water we have to produce into the future. And had we not embarked on an enormous conservation program years ago, we would have had 2 or 3 Vista Ridges up to now. And so it saves money, it saves water resources throughout the state. We have to look at this from a larger perspective. But it is a sobering thought to know that all of these people are going to be coming to Texas, and that's a great thing. Growth is good, bad growth is bad, and so you've got to be able to do it in the appropriate way. But yes, we will need water supplies to accommodate and to handle some of that growth. But I think as long as you have a good system in place where you're conserving all that you can, you're reusing as much as you can, I think it's certainly able to be accommodated.
Okay. John, how about you? Any final thoughts?
I guess in terms of a final thought, I'll sort of piggyback on Cassie's thought is that it's in the same spirit of one of the famous quotes that came out of that electropurification debate. Our lobbyist, Brian Sledge, during one of the hearings, they were asking this question about, you Hays County citizens, why have you always been opposed to this? You fought it at every angle, and now it's a problem. You get what you deserve. And our lobbyist response to that is that in his memory, no groundwater conservation district was ever created before there was a problem. And so I think that's our typical nature, is to react to things. And it's always in a panicked moment, and things try to get done very quickly, and compromises are made, and we don't know the consequences of those compromises until down the road. So I guess to Cassie's point is that to the extent you have any issues or concerns about groundwater, just stay engaged, pay attention. Our little groundwater conservation district was just invisible to everybody until this big issue arose, and now people know who we are and what we do and see us as a valuable resource. Now that you're aware of these constructs and these things that are in place to manage groundwater, just pay attention, stay engaged, go to these meetings, provide your input on the upfront planning side. I can tell you that I'm a member of Groundwater Management Area 10. We have meetings in San Antonio every quarter, and nobody shows up. Nobody cares. Nobody provides any input until there's a problem. And it's always after the fact. It's also a reactionary thing. So pay attention and get engaged if you can.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all three of our panelists. Thank you so much, and thank you all for your great questions and for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We now have I think a generous about hour and a half lunch break. So please go eat, talk to each other, and then come back at 1:15 for our TNC panel, which should be great. Thank you all much.